You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome to Autumn on the Air. Today we're exploring an intersection that many of us in tech transfer think about, but rarely address head-on. How the soft skills of communication, coaching, and stakeholder alignment are just as critical to successful IP strategy as the legal and technical expertise behind the patents themselves. My guest today brings a truly distinctive combination of credentials to this conversation. Steve Hall is the intellectual property team lead at Bricker Graydon Wyatt in Louisville, Kentucky. Steve's path to patent law was anything but conventional. A former R&D chemist, he spent the first 12 years of his legal career handling medical malpractice and civil defense litigation before transitioning to patent, trade secret, and contract law roughly 20 years ago. Since then, he has helped universities, corporations of all sizes, and independent innovators secure and enforce IP rights across a wide range of industries, including biotechnology, therapeutics, solar energy, catalysts, chemical sampling, motion sensing, healthcare, and software, and has helped clients achieve ROI through acquisitions, licenses, and settlements. But here's what makes Steve especially relevant for our audience. In addition to his patent prosecution work, he advises universities on IP policy and best practices, with effective communication being a particular point of emphasis. He is also a certified coach trained by the International Coaching Federation, and he serves as an adjunct MBA professor at the University of Louisville, where he teaches technology leadership and innovation strategy to future business leaders. That combination of patent attorney, certified coach, and educator gives him a unique lens on how tech transfer offices can strengthen their impact, not only through stronger IP portfolios, but through better alignment, clearer storytelling, and more effective stakeholder engagement. Steve, welcome to Autumn on the Air. We're really glad to have you here.
Thank you, Lisa. It's fantastic to be here with you today.
I'm really excited about our conversation, Steve, because you've had an incredible career trajectory and you've had a very unconventional path to IP law. And your career's just been absolutely fascinating because you started out as an R&D chemist, then you were a medical malpractice attorney. That's not someone I run into very often in IP law. And then you transitioned to patent law. And, that's not the typical path that we normally associate with IP attorneys. So walk us through, if you wouldn't mind, what prompted that transition and how your experience in the courtroom with medical malpractice cases shaped how you approach your patent work today.
Absolutely. So I was a chemist before law school and actually went to law school at the University of Cincinnati with the idea of becoming a patent lawyer. I'm originally from Louisville. When law school ended, we decided that we wanted to be in Louisville. And that was in the early to mid 90s, and the market was different then than it is today. So the way things opened up was to go into this litigation firm and handle cases like medical malpractice cases and occasionally an adverse drug reaction, which tapped into my science about as well as anything could that's not patent law. What happened after that was really interesting because I did that for 12 years and gained a lot of experience with that. I would not have had it any other way, but it was always in my heart to go into patent law. And 12 years in, the opportunity presented itself as a result of a law firm merger that I was part of. And the firm we were merging with did have an intellectual property group. So it was natural. And I mentioned that for, your listeners, because we all have goals and we're all at a point A in some way and we want to get to a point B. And sometimes you need to open the door yourself, and sometimes the door just opens for you. And that was my case. I'd love to say that I planned it out from the beginning, that this is what I'm going to do. But so often it only makes sense when you look at it in the rearview mirror. And it definitely was a good thing.
I think one word that comes to mind when I hear your story is patience, right? Because you were very patient and allowed things to evolve in such a way that the opportunity to get into IP law just kind of naturally came to you instead of, being impatient. Because I don't know that many firms would have taken somebody who had a med malpractice background and just accepted them outright to switch gears and go into patent law. So I think the fact that you were so patient and you had this firm merger kind of allowed this kind of organic switch to take place.
That's true. And it's an interesting thing about vision, because I did have some discussions with firms along the way and feel like I put out, a very clear vision of where I wanted to go. But under those circumstances, it doesn't always work out like that, which is totally understandable.
So were there some skills from your time practicing medical malpractice litigation that you thought were particularly helpful in your patent practice?
You might be surprised about the skill I'm about to mention, but I would say it like this. A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that sounds routine. It's not. It's not. It's something that I carry with me ever since those days of presenting cases to judges and juries. And if you talk to jury consultants who observe these trials, they'll tell you candidly that many times story is hard to follow. And it's told by witnesses who are hard to connect with. It's not hard to follow for the lawyers. It's hard to follow for the audience, the jury. And just this idea that, okay, let's do the pressure test. Are we covering all the bases of, is there a logical beginning, middle, and end? And sometimes it's the subparts that you also need to make sure cover those bases in order for it to flow well.
Now, you've worked with a wide range of clients over your patent law career, from universities to Fortune 500 companies to startups to independent inventors. And obviously, those experiences differ. What have you learned from working across such a diverse client base that helps inform the work that you do with university TTOs?
Well, one thing is to try to see the world through the person's eyes, because there are so many different perspectives that people have when they're in leadership. And one of the words that I always come back to is accountability, in the sense of person who is my primary contact is always accountable. Sometimes it's accountable to a board of directors or a CEO, maybe to themselves, but they're always accountable. They're always interested in the outcome. And the way that looks in practice among a diverse client base is the idea of, okay, who else is in the chain there whose perspectives is going to matter? So who needs to be consulted on a particular question? And I don't mean that I need to go do the consulting, but the person that I'm working with needs to do that. Or who within the organization is going to have influence? I was in a meeting one time, and I was with my primary contact before the meeting began, and he said, the person who will make the decision over this multi-year program is in town today. And, this person will have a lot of influence over the outcome. So in those moments, you think, wow, this is different than, hey, Steve, what is what are the claims going to look like? You're really my person I'm dealing with primarily is thinking, what is the big picture? So that's one of the main differences.
Now, we're going to talk a lot about IP strategy and communication because that's an area that you're particularly strong in. And you advise universities on IP policy and best practices with a real emphasis on communication and being effective in terms of communicating. So, Steve, when you walk into a university TTO for the first time, what are some of the most common maybe communication breakdowns or maybe misalignments that you tend to see around IP strategy?
Let me say what the misalignment is first, and then let me give an example of someone who's doing it well and kind of dovetail off of both, if it's okay. One of the main areas of miscommunication is simply expectations. Because if I'm a faculty inventor and I submit a disclosure, I could have a range of expectations about what happens next. It might be, I hope this is largely black box and I don't have to do very much. It might be, I've come up with something that is incredible. I have reached the finish line or very close to it. And the technology transfer professional is looking at it saying, we're at the starting line. So those expectations need to be put into alignment. And there's a whole number of different ways that can happen that I know we're going to talk about through this conversation. One of the organizations who's doing a really good job that I have the pleasure to work with is Kentucky Commercialization Ventures. They advise a number of universities and colleges in Kentucky on intellectual property policy. And what I think is a really great opportunity, some of these institutions have relatively new IP policies. Some of them are in the process of forming their IP policy and strategy. So to be able to come into that and I'm brought in to give advice as well on how to structure the policy, and really just how to present it. It's not an event. It's not something where you say, here's the policy, let's go. It's more of a process that unfolds. I'd like to speak a little more to that if it's okay. I'd give a concrete example.
Absolutely.
In 2024, the autumn Midwest meeting was held in Louisville, Kentucky. And I had the pleasure to be on a panel that was led by Jericho Wilkerson, who's with KCV. And the panel was on intellectual property policies. And it was great. We prepared everything. And one of the comments that I said during that session was, in technology transfer, one of your jobs is to make this policy make sense. And I paused. It doesn't sound groundbreaking at all. As I looked in a certain section of the room, I saw a handful of heads just come up, and they it struck them. I mean, they were generating some ideas about that. Maybe it was, they could really relate with that, but for some reason that statement resonated with them. And you'll be able to see, I mean, if you read surveys in the technology transfer world, and I've seen some of these, they'll have questions like, in the tech transfer office, to what extent are you aware of the IP policy and how it's supposed to work? And then looked at it from the other side, you're a technology transfer professional. What is your view of how your faculty inventors understand this policy and, feel engaged to work under it? And you've probably seen surveys like that too. The results are pretty telling.
Very telling. Yeah, absolutely. Now, keeping on this theme for a little bit, we tend to see that many tech transfer offices are excellent at the technical and legal side of IP, kind of what you were just alluding to. They're great at filing patents, negotiating licenses, but they struggle in terms of articulating the strategic value of their work to whether it's leadership at the university, their faculty, or even more importantly, external partners. How do you work with TTOs to help them communicate their stories more effectively?
Well, this draws a lot upon the first question. it relates to my background in medical malpractice. So the other thing I learned in that was the importance of being audience centered in anything you say. So the first thing we have to look at is who is the audience and what is their level of skill, experience, and interest in this area, because all that goes to how much attention they're able to pay to it. And I think that's one thing that makes stories really powerful. You can cover a lot of ground with stories if you do the right thing. So as I mentioned, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But what does that really look like? In the context of picking an appropriate storyline for it, that's when you can really start to see the beginning and the middle and the end. So, you'll see founders who come forward and say, not only did I research in this area, but I was a person who dealt with this condition that we're trying to solve and make better. I am a living, breathing symbol of the why behind this. It's really powerful if you have something like that and if it's authentic, because that connects with, let's say you're trying to raise money, that really connects with people. There's a level of empathy with that. Maybe the person that you're talking to, you won't even know it, but they know someone who had the same situation. So that's one type of storyline. Another type of storyline is the person who saw something almost hiding in plain sight. When you have that, it's a really interesting story to unfold. Have you seen the movie Flash of Genius?
I have not seen that one.
It's an excellent movie about patents. And I'll just say it is based on a true story set in the early 1960s in Detroit, when every car manufacturer was trying to solve the problem of our windshield wipers only go one speed. All of these R&D departments were looking at it from, how do we adjust to the rain? What do we do with the level of the rain? And it was a person in his own basement who said, it's not about the rain, it's about the drag. And he saw something that was literally hiding in plain sight. If we put a sensor on that wiper, then we can send a signal that it wasn't variable in the sense we know it today, but at least it would stop the bottom of the cycle. That's to me, that's what makes that movie really incredible. And if anybody hasn't seen it, it's worth a watch.
I'm going to definitely put that on my list to watch for sure.
Just a couple other storylines that are out there, whether it's in an industry or at a university, there are people out there who were at ground level for this industry. They know all the patents, they know all the players, and that's something that really lends itself to, where did we start from? Well, we have a person who was there at the beginning, and you build that story out from there.
Now, I want to go back to IP policy at universities, because that's something you work on with TTOs as well. And that can be a very sensitive topic because it touches on a number of different things, whether it's academic freedom, revenue expectations, faculty incentives, and institutional values. So I know you've helped a lot of universities approach defining or developing or refining their IP policies. What's your approach in actually building consensus when it comes to IP policy rather than friction?
My approach is twofold. One of them is stories, which I'd like to come back to. But the other is something that I've learned over the years. And this is just the structure that I put it into. We're in our interactions, there are three things. We are wired for structure. We crave clarity, and action is what pulls it all together. And all the people you mentioned in some way or other feel more comfortable when all three of those things are being touched upon. It might be, the clarity could be the why behind this. The structure could be just a simple, here's a timeline of what you can expect. over the course of time. Or it might be showing them that we have a structured way of dealing with licenses. And then once the person understands it, once it makes sense to them, it can go a long way in removing friction. So that's one thing. The other thing, we were talking about stories around the innovation. This is another area where stories can be used. We do a training that looks at stories like there's a case called Felana versus Kent State. It's a published case where the university wound up having to share the patent rights with an inventor who owned a portion of it individually. They didn't get the person's assignment at the time because they didn't expect the person would contribute anything inventive. They were brought in for testing. So we tell that story, and we talk about processes that would have made a difference in that. We talk about Stanford versus Roche, where, and a lot of people are familiar with that. It went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and there were two different competing assignments by one of the inventors. Same result. The university did not own the full rights to a patent. And we even come up with a hypothetical that we try to put them in the position of, how would you deal with this situation if it happened in your university? And more importantly, how can a good policy that people are willing to engage with and understand have helped that? So that's what we do. And I think that this is almost like sandpaper for the friction that can arise, because you're reframing it instead of this is a bunch of rules that we have to follow to, how do we practice and move forward in a way that helps everybody who's under this policy?
Now, in addition to your medical malpractice experience, you also have some other very interesting background experience. You're a patent attorney who's also a certified coach through the International Coaching Federation. That's a unusual combination that I have to admit I haven't run across before. So I'm curious, what led you to pursue a coaching certification, and how does that training change maybe the way you work with clients, particularly those in the university context?
I did a presentation in 2022 called How to Tell Your Innovation Story to Every Audience. And it's in line with all the things we're talking about. And while I was preparing for that, I was thinking about the things that we all do, that experts and faculty inventors alike, they have this outstanding training. I mean, they have climbed to high places in their career. And especially around innovation, it can often be dense subject matter, heavy on the jargon. And I thought of this phrase, it's an expert's paradox. And the reason I thought about that was the expert witnesses that I worked with when I was doing medical malpractice, that it's the same thing in that area. You can be the greatest expert, the most published, knowledgeable person in the world, but the jury in those cases have to be able to understand you. And so I started thinking about it that way. And I was basically catapulted forward in my career as I started thinking about this to do this training through the International Coaching Federation, because it's a way of facilitated thinking. It's helping another person think well and generate ideas and helping them move toward a clear and defined future state, which in my case was, how do we help innovators tell a story most effectively for the audience they're in front of? And that's how I got into it. That was 4 years ago. I took my time. I was very patient. I did the training mostly nights and weekends over the course of about 20 months, and then tested through the ICF.
So it sounds like it's kind of like self-paced study, and then there's an exam at the end. So there's no real time pressure to get it done in a certain amount of time, is what it sounds like.
That's correct.
Very, very neat.
100%, which worked well for me.
Yeah, definitely being a patent attorney during the day. Yeah, for sure. Now, Steve, tech transfer professionals often find themselves in situations where they have to align stakeholders who have very different incentives, a faculty inventor, a licensing team, university leadership, and an industry partner. So how has this coaching approach helped you navigate all these different dynamics compared to maybe just taking a typical lawyer, legal, transactional approach?
That's an important question. Well, let me mention a couple of the competencies that we're tested on with the Coaching Federation. So one of the important ones is evoking awareness, which is, it's not my ideas that are going to be important. It's facilitating the discussion so someone else comes up with the idea. There's something in psychology that I learned about called the generation effect. And the generation effect was published in 1978. It's been affirmed in a number of other studies since then. But it basically says, if I have an idea myself, if I generate it myself, I am much more likely to act upon that idea than if someone else tells me the idea. It's human nature. And that's one of the things that evoking awareness is about. Simply by trying to see the whole playing field, it might look like encouraging someone to see the other perspective on this. Certainly, there's a lot of trust that has to get built into that when you have people who look at a situation differently and have different interests. So that is a big one right there. The other thing I try to do, and this is a competency too, is active listening. You're listening for what the words are, but you're also listening for what is not being said. And sometimes that can be just as important.
Yeah, and a lot of people need I think you think you're active listening sometimes, and I think you're not really active listening. So I think that's one that we could probably all use some help with.
Yeah, and in our world, we have a lot of things going on. So attention is a very important thing. There's a couple other things on this point that I would mention. I heard someone say recently, and it really landed with me well, that when you have a group of people like this and they are differently situated, they're still probably going to agree on 80% of the issues, meaning there's 20% that you have to work on. And actually, it can be insightful if you look at a situation and say, no, they don't agree on 80% of the issues. They agree on 40% of the issues. So maybe that's telling you something. But, let's just use that as a general rule of thumb. The vast majority of issues they would agree upon. So you spend 80% of your time on the things that they need to be brought together on. And, for the other 20% of the time, you're reminding them that, hey, you agree on most of this. And there's a lot of reflecting back for those areas where there is a divergence. There's a lot of reflecting back to say, I hear what you're saying. You're looking at it like this. And then that just shows, yeah, I'm listening to you. I hear you. There's always another side, but before we get there, I'm hearing you. And I think I would say on this, if people take one thing away from the podcast when it comes to this helping people move forward, it would be this. The 3 steps are really important. Wired for structure. We crave clarity. Action pulls it all together. If a person looks at that and then develops the habit of seeing several different perspectives at one time, it will really go a long way in relationships.
So given that, Steve, is there an example you can share with us, and you don't have to name names if you can't, where applying coaching principles in the university IP context led to meaningfully better outcomes than maybe a more traditional approach might have led?
Yes, this example shows my evolution in how I approach such things. A client has a situation with a patent where they had been trying to get a license for a number of years. Lots of correspondence with this operator in the marketplace, and they did not get anywhere. And there is a feeling that there's, infringement. And the operator was recently acquired by an investment company. So the question that was put to me was, we are thinking about sending a letter to the investment company, private equity, just to inform them about, hey, we own these patents. Do you think we should do it? Now, there's a part of me, I think there's a part in all of us who wants to jump out. You know where I'm going with that. Oh, here's the answer. Let me tell you. And we can start with, well, you don't want to, the basic rule is you don't want them to think they're about to get sued and they file a declaratory action. Sure. That's the basic rule. And, there was a time when I would have said that and said, but if you do it this way, you'll probably be okay. I didn't do that here. I started asking a few more questions about it, and probably not important to go into the detail of what the questions are. But at one point, person I was talking to said, you sound hesitant about this. And I said, I'm not hesitant. I'm trying to complete the picture. So that's an example of just trying to be as present as possible and not rushing out, but hanging back again, being patient. Try to ask one more question if you can. And that's a coaching principle right there, because we will give suggestions. I was being asked in that case for legal advice. So just kind of to clarify one thing, I'm usually not brought in to say provide coaching services to us. Rather, I provide legal advice that's informed by my background in coaching. And this is a good example of that. So try to ask another question before you insert your suggestion into it is a good rule of thumb.
Absolutely. And always, you never know what that question might uncover in a piece of information that could really alter a critical decision like you just mentioned. So, Steve, in addition to, being a patent attorney and you have this coaching background, you're also involved at the University of Louisville in teaching a course on technology leadership and innovation strategy. You're an adjunct MBA professor there. What are some of the most important things you want future business leaders to understand about intellectual property and tech transfer?
That is a wonderful question. First and foremost, the matter of primary importance, respect other people's intellectual property. And if you're leading a company that owns intellectual property, expect that it will be respected by others. And then, there's a whole lot of room under that umbrella of what that actually looks like. But that is an important principle that we talk about a lot in that class. I try to make the patent system make sense to them. And one thing that I've done with that is I talk to them about the statutes that are involved, the statutes that involve prior art, Section 102 and Section 103, novelty and non-obviousness. I explain that to them. I point out that that's what happens before the patent is granted. And then I point out Section 271, which defines what infringement is. And I point out that that's what happens after the patent is granted. And this is just one other thing that I thought about while teaching the class. It's interesting to me. I don't know that I'd ever picked up on it before, but the pre-patent, the 102 and 103 say, as you're entitled to a patent unless,
yes.
And then the other one, the infringement said, you are an infringer if. And for someone who's not familiar with the patent system, sometimes just stating it in a way like that, I said, well, that's pretty interesting. Now we have these verbs, make, use, sell, offer, import. So it makes it more tangible for them to consider it that way.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things about teaching is I have a class that I teach as well. And I really think that it helps to sharpen how you communicate with clients and stakeholders. I'm curious, do you find it shaping your practice in a similar way or in additional ways?
Yes, I do. And really, this probably goes all the way back to when I began practicing patent law. It's been a constant evolution for me on how to explain it. And I was thinking about what you do with your podcast. It's probably been an evolution of how you approach it, the way you put me at ease today, the way you explain the process. So that evolves too. So we're constantly looking for other ways. But I just go back to trying to put myself in the shoes of the person who's learning it. And I'm really fortunate in that way because I did the litigation work for a long time, and then I got to learn something entirely new. And that was different than if I would have gone straight into it. And I found myself regularly saying, this is when I was learning patent law, this is much like, and then, pick what it is. This is much like talking to an expert witness, or this is much like putting on a rebuttal case. I would learn those kinds of things. And I'm a pretty associative thinker anyway, so I try to find things that the students are familiar with and compare it to that.
Now, Steve, I want to talk to you a little bit about the current IP landscape, because there's a lot that universities are navigating right now, whether it's AI-related inventorship questions, the constant kind of issues around patent eligibility standards, and of course, now there are significantly tighter budgets. From your vantage point, working with a number of different institutions, what do you think are some of the biggest IP challenges facing university TTOs right now?
Artificial intelligence is interesting because it's both a challenge and an opportunity. So I'll talk about that. And then I also want to talk about engagement, because I think that's also part of the equation that we're talking about here. On the topic of artificial intelligence, and particularly around inventorship, I think it's important to remember that machine learning has been around longer than, say, ChatGPT or, the other things that people frequently use. For anyone who's interested, I happened to find an article that was published in 2025 in Drug Design and Discovery. The title is Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning in Drug Discovery, 2020 through 2025. And it goes back to at least 2020 and points out how machine learning has been used. And I've observed some of this myself with the clients that I've worked with. I think it's important to note that whether that crosses some line or approaches some line is very context specific, but people have been doing it for a while now. And the innovation might be in the preparation that leads to the use of the machine, like anything else. They're using it as a tool for that. And the innovation could be what happens before that. And sure, this article talks about how there can be candidate selection through this, but there's also innovation happening after that. So what I'm saying is, I don't think there's going to be a bright line by courts that says artificial intelligence was involved. There's no way you can get a patent on this. I do think that people need to be careful because with it, I'll give a couple statements on that. So I think about computers that have existed, for as long as you and I have been practicing law. They help you. They're basically storage, the ability to apply, to use formulas and things like that. Where you get into artificial intelligence, it's more the evaluation, it's more the analysis of large data sets, looking for trends and things, and then the generative aspect. And I wouldn't tell anybody that you should never use AI, but what I would say is you should be really careful when it comes to anything that artificial intelligence is generating. There are emerging cases, and I'm sure there will be a lot more, on if a person uses artificial intelligence for doing their own research, say, is that discoverable in litigation later? Now, this is not in the context of patents or innovation, but the answer is it depends. like most anything. But I was thinking the other day, imagine, someone comes up with a great idea and they spend a lot of time on ChatGPT refining the idea or just whatever it might be. In a classic sense, that'll be discoverable in litigation 7 years down the line if there's a very valuable IP right. And I don't know that it will have to be disclosed to the patent office or that it would keep you from getting a patent. But, the law firms in those situations will look at that with very high interest, especially if the whole idea of innovation is your own ideas. So that's one thing that I see that universities and companies alike should be sure to tell their inventors, be aware of this.
Yeah, it's going to be really fascinating to see how this all evolves. And once some of the big cases hit the courts, it's just going to be fascinating. And it's going to be a very long process before we get any certainty. And I have a feeling the way the courts will decide it, it'll be a very narrow issue. And we'll be left wondering on a bigger, broader perspective like we most often are. But I agree with you. It's going to be really fascinating to watch going forward.
Yeah, and it could muddy the water, even if someone is right. Just the fact that an opponent can bring that up in litigation.
Can you imagine the costs that's going to add to litigation? If you have to go through all the ChatGPT records and everything like that, and discovery is so incredibly expensive already, can you just imagine having to review all those different searches?
Yeah, it will just add to the volume of data at someone's disposal.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Steve, if a tech transfer professional is listening to our conversation today and thinking, I want to be a better communicator and a more effective advocate for our IP program, what do you think is one thing that they can start to do right away?
This is one thing that I would offer. Pick a meeting that you have upcoming where you're one-on-one with somebody, someone that you're serving, say a faculty inventor, perhaps, and start the meeting by saying, what is one thing that you want to get out of this meeting? What would make this meeting successful for you? It's important to be discerning, to find the right situation to do that in. But in my experience, when I'm talking with someone, if I know what's important to them, it can really help me out as we go through the meeting. And don't just stop at asking the question of them, but at some point during the meeting, come back to it. You told me, at the outset, you said you wanted to understand how we talk to potential licensees better. How is this meeting going in terms of that? And then you hope they say, oh, I've got clarity on that. Thank you. I appreciate it. And you're still talking about something else. It's not to say you're only going to talk about one issue at that meeting, but that was what was on their mind as the most important thing, and you've addressed it. Now, let's say you ask that question and they say, well, as a faculty inventor, I should be getting twice as much money. You don't have to panic in that setting. You can say something like, I hear you, but you know where you need to go in the discussion at this point. And so everybody is helped by that. It's a relational thing, but the one thing, that's what I wanted to point out, because I think that can make a difference in setting the tone for a meeting.
Absolutely. I think that's some great advice that you've provided there. So, Steve, as the podcast comes to a close, I wanted to ask you if you could give one piece of advice to a tech transfer director who wants to strengthen both their IP strategy and their team's ability to communicate that strategy to stakeholders, whether it's faculty or university leadership or industry partners. What would that be?
It would be that involvement leads to engagement. And that can look like different things depending on the people you're talking about. But in the context of a faculty, from time to time, invite faculty to the IP committee meetings who are not on the committee. But hey, come and listen to this. And hopefully they learn some things, and don't just stop at they've come and listened, but if they have a greater sense of clarity about what's going on, share that with other people in your department. So that would be one example. I really think there are a number of things that one could do with faculty also, is get them involved with other people at the university, whether it's someone from the College of Business, maybe co-presenting at a conference, or even after a successful patent prosecution, maybe co-authoring an article with someone on the tech transfer team. Just, this was my experience. This was the story of this patent, and here are the takeaways. Things like that bring engagement. They're good opportunities, and you have to pick your spots because not everybody wants to do that and everybody's busy. But I think there are some people out there in the university who would resonate with that and just would look at it like, this is going to help me develop professionally, this interaction. So let's do it. So that would be one thing. I know I'm limited to one thing. I wish I wasn't.
Well, Steve, this has been a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed learning more about you and your practice and your coaching and how you've been able to influence your clients through your coaching experience as well as your teaching. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been a really great experience, and it felt very conversational to be on your podcast, and I appreciate it, like just almost as if we were sitting here having a cup of coffee. And I know that comes from a lot of experience on your part, and I appreciate the opportunity.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you again, Steve. Steve, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation. You've given us a fresh perspective on how the skills of coaching and communication can elevate the work of tech transfer, reminding us that strong IP strategy isn't just about the patents on the paper. It's about the people in the room and how well we align them around a shared vision. For our listeners, we'll include links in the show notes to learn more about Steve's work, as well as information about the International Coaching Federation and its coaching competencies for those of you who are curious about how coaching skills might complement your own practice. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with colleagues who might benefit from thinking about the intersection of IP strategy, communication, and leadership. Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air. We'll see you again next week.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at autm.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.